Hey guys, Nub Tactics here, Zilia Rangris. This is going to be a relatively informal video, more of a rant really. I just want to get my thoughts out on the current state of healing and savage content in Final Fantasy XIV. There probably won't be much relevant footage to go along with what I had to talk about, but I will be providing stock footage of my dungeon content if you'd like something to watch while I ramble. Healers in Party Finder seems to be at an all-time low. There are plenty of memes circulating about how party finders are constantly looking for healers, and I think even fairly recently Yoshi P made a statement on the content balancing with respect to healing requirements. After talking to some of my friends, they seemed to echo the prior sentiment of healing being too easy, where you just kind of cast your GCD spell until you need to use your OGCD to cover for a mechanic. But anyway, here are my thoughts on the matter. In terms of playability and quality of life, I think healers are doing okay. Some classes are doing better than others. Sage is a very cozy class for beginners, with their toolkit lending for high mobility while providing heals. White Mage's Afflatus Misery change makes it so that they are free to provide a lot more healing for the party while going DPS neutral, because their Afflatus Misery does more damage now, and this is pretty phenomenal for progression environments. They are also the only class that can effectively trigger Divine Veil without incurring a DPS loss, because for whatever reason, Pneuma doesn't trigger the effect of Divine Veil, which I think is really strange. I think that should be fixed. Astrologist and Scholar are kind of in weird situations. Aetherflow is still a very strange resource system, and I personally still disagree with the idea of having to give up damage to heal the party. Yes, I do know that the DPS gain from using 3 energy drains is near negligible, but ultimately it just kind of doesn't feel good to have to give up DPS when you know that you could have had that DPS gain regardless of how small it is. Astro is also similarly in a strange situation, in the sense that light speed is basically required in buff windows to maximize party damage increases, while being a 90-second cooldown instead of 2 minutes. Similarly, the removal of sleeve draw and the nerfed redraw mechanic makes getting an optimized Astrodyne in Endwalker much less likely than an optimized Divination in Shadowbringers. I do understand that redraw recently got changed so that you won't redraw the same seal, a change which was severely overdue, but the math still hashes out that you are less likely to get an optimized Endwalker Astrodyne than an optimized Shadowbringers Divination. Minor Arcana adding an element of RNG as to whether or not you can get damage or healing also doesn't seem very great to me. It is a cooldown that you almost can't plan around in a raiding metagame which is strongly focused towards playing around timelines and mapping out when to use abilities. In terms of combat, healing is fundamentally a very boring role. You are either healing, or you are doing your 2-button DPS rotation. At its core, this is literally all you're doing. As I said near the start of this video, some of my friends mentioned a plethora of people they knew talking about how healing was too easy and that there wasn't enough going on. Well, what I didn't mention at the start of this video was that my friends also said that most of these people complaining were static raiders. If you're a static healer and you think that healing is boring, this is what I had to say. Healing isn't going to become much more interesting if you increase the amount of outgoing damage. Think about it. What's really going to change if you up the damage a little bit? If you're a barrier healer, sometimes you'll have to shield more often. Maybe you'll have to cast Medica 2 or Aspected Helios every once in a while, up from literally never because your OGCD healing might not be enough to top off the party. This still doesn't change the fact that you're still mapping healing to a timeline, and then DPS botting during all the downtime in between. And in static, everyone moves as a coordinated team. You should know what your co-healers are mapping on their healing. Mistakes should be minimized because everyone is using an agreed upon strat that you've all practiced. Healing is not going to become any more interesting just because every once in a while you have to cast 2 more heals than you otherwise would have. For any given fight, you are still memorizing a sequence of healing abilities and executing it the same way every single time, only stopping the DPS every once in a while. So yeah. Healing is a bit of a mindless chore. Until it isn't. Well, when isn't it dull and dreary? When your party members are making mistakes and dying, or nearly dying for it. Healing is a role where you have to play the players. or in other words, be ready to respond to changes and inaccuracies with respect to what the rest of your party is doing. When there aren't any such mistakes, healing is really easy. But when there are mistakes, it can be extremely challenging. This isn't even to mention if you are the one that dies due to either your own or another person's mistakes. Many of the healer role's healing abilities are tied to a resource, unless you're Astrologian, and dying means losing all of those built-up resources. When you combine this with an MP penalty and weakness that both cuts your damage output and your healing, your death can severely hamper your ability to even do otherwise trivial heal requirements like raidwides. In less certain environments, you have to be prepared to spend extra resources when something goes wrong. If a DPS takes extra damage from a raidwide because of damage variance, or simply because they made a mistake, and there's another raidwide coming up really soon, you need to be aware enough to drop extra targeted healing on them so they don't die. If a party member is standing in the wrong place for a mechanic, you are capable of rescuing them to the correct position to either prevent them from dying or the party from wiping. Therefore, that's your responsibility. Even though your party member is the one making a mistake, you are still throwing if you are capable of fixing it and you don't. If you are aware that a healer stack mechanic is going to happen soon, and your co-healer recently died, you need to be cognizant enough to either raise that healer on your stack spot and then move to their stack position, or raise them somewhere away from your party, have them solo the stack with Transcendence, and then move back to your own stack position, to minimize the risk of further deaths due to random stack targeting. All of these subtle nuances are complexities that high-level healing needs to contend with in exchange for not really having a rotation. Increased damage on raid damage doesn't really have that much influence on static healing, but it has a significant impact on party finder healing. Imagine going into PF and joining any random party. You don't know how skilled any of the other party members are. And even if your co-healer is pretty good, their exact healing timeline won't be the same as the last healer you played with. They might not even be the same barrier or pure healer role as the last healer you played with. You don't know if they'll overheal everything, or if they won't heal at all. You don't know if the tanks you're playing with will dump all of their mitigations on tank busters, or if they won't mitigate anything. You don't know if the DPS will cycle their raid mitigations on raidwides like they should. So, on top of already needing to keep your healing and resource management more flexible than usual for Party Finder, you need to be even more ready to compensate for mistakes, because you don't know how many mistakes your Party Finder allies will make, or where they're going to make them. Even in a static, if party members make mistakes, if you play with them long enough, you can sort of get an idea of what kind of mechanics they struggle with, and prepare in advance for that. But obviously you can't do that in Party Finder unless you regularly see the same people while looking for groups. And when you bump up the raid damage on top of already having to manage all of this, that leaves you with a much more difficult mental stack to track while needing to use more resources to make sure you can even recover if something goes wrong. I still feel like the culture of responsibility for keeping the party alive largely rests on the healers, even though recent changes have made it so that it's possible for all party members to participate in mitigation. Addle and Feint now mitigate both magic and physical damage, but I still don't see it regularly cycled in Party Finder. Earlier, I said that if a party member had lower HP than average, the healer needs to be ready to heal them a bit if there's a raidwide incoming. Well, that's actually not a healer-exclusive responsibility, and yet I can say with relative confidence that the number of times I've seen a tank use their on-demand party mitigation on a weakened party member is less than 20 times. Although I will say, the last static that I regularly raided with, the Dark Knight I played with was fairly on top of TBNing weakened party members. Thanks Bears, you're a real one. The in-game battle prompt doesn't do a very good job of indicating how much damage is mitigated when an attack hits you. It doesn't show whether an attack is doing physical damage or magic damage, which I still find to be fairly absurd. When you combine this with the Final Fantasy XIV culture of vilifying the use of parses and battle logs when discussing damage output, healing, and mitigation for the purposes of clearing, it's incredibly difficult to hold other people accountable for lack of mitigation. It's hard to call out a machinist for not using Tactician to mitigate a raid-wide, but it's very easy to be mad at a scholar for not casting Succor, a healing GCD that's always available, to mitigate instead. All this is to bring me to the point that in the current state, healing is either mind-numbingly boring when everyone's playing correctly, or horrendously stressful if things are going wrong. Increasing raid damage won't make fights less boring when things are going right, but they do make fights much more unbearable when they're going terribly. And without any call for accountability for other roles to start properly using their mitigations or healing, I think it's no wonder that healing is such an unpopular role to play right now. This is all I really had to say on the issue. If you stayed with my rambling until the end, I do appreciate you listening to what I had to say. If you haven't gathered by now, I am pretty disillusioned with healing at the moment. I have always been a Black Mage main, and still do consider myself one, but have been unable to play Black Mage or otherwise DPS in a regular raiding or static environment for the past 3 raid tiers, due to some reason or another. Some of them self-inflicted, some of them not. Either way though, it's made me a bit tired of healing. Feel free to leave a comment if you disagree or agree with anything I had to say, and until next time, I will catch you guys later.